I know that he's getting a lot of pressure from Republicans to not make an announcement because it could negatively impact the Georgia runoff. But even if he announces, being a candidate for president doesn't mean that you aren't subject to the laws and that you aren't subject to being held accountable for violations of crimes that you have committed in the past. And as Joyce said, there could be exculpatory evidence, but it's highly unlikely that if there was, we wouldn't have heard it. If there was, his lawyers would have announced. So I'm assuming that there's only more evidence against him than we already know publicly, and that is already sufficient to indict.
So speaking of what we know, Joyce, NBC has learned the January 6th committee's written report is going to focus on Trump's role in the insurrection. I wonder if that could be a signal to federal prosecutors.
So I think that this is part of the public record and the committee's focus. And in some ways, I regret this. I wish we were going to learn more about the information that the committee gathered about how this sort of imperfect storm of January 6th happened. What were the law enforcement failures, the intelligence failures that permitted this to happen? But I think you're right to suggest that their focus on Donald Trump is meant in many ways to signal their seriousness to the White House and to the Justice Department about just how much evidence they've compiled. We've talked a lot about the Mar-a-Lago investigation, and the evidence there seems to be fairly clear. The charges are simple. Ultimately, they're really theft charges and obstruction charges, theft of government property and trying to cover up the crime. January 6th is far more complicated. It requires a lot of evidentiary hurdles to link the former president into what we've seen, in many ways viewed as conspiracies to interfere with government functions. That's not to say that it's not doable, but it is a much more difficult case. So the committee, I think, is trying to send a message to DOJ about their level of seriousness, given what they've seen in the evidence.
Jill, your sense of if Trump's going to be able to run out the clock with his lawsuit against the 1-6 committee?
No, I'm not. First of all, there's now a chance that the House will be able to continue. There's also a chance that the investigation could be transferred to the Senate, which now is going to be again in the hands of the Democrats. But I think Joyce is right. I wish that the report that is coming, assuming that they do issue it before the end of the year, was broader. When we say January 6th, it isn't the insurrection on January 6th alone that I worry about. I worry about all of the other parts of his attempt to overturn the election and to undo our democracy. His pressure on the vice president, his fake electors scheme, his pressure on state legislatures. So I think there's a lot more to it than we have talked about, and we shouldn't be focused only on the insurrection and the violence of January 6th.